During the first hour, a subject that I find to be an intriguing subject. You know, when you read the Old Testament and you look at the content of the Old Testament, you deal with the sacrificial system and the kings and the judges and the prophets. And all of a sudden you come into the New Testament and you're now confronted with Pharisees and Sadducees and Sanhedrins and synagogues and all these other things, and you have to stop and wonder, wait a minute, when I got done reading Malachi, there was none of this stuff. Now, where did it all come from? The intertestamental period is that period of time between Malachi and the coming of the Lord Jesus. Or you might say between Malachi and Mark, or no matter how you want to put it. It's that period of time, that silent period of time in which a great deal happened, which causes the New Testament to deal with issues and concepts that had previously been unknown in the Old Testament. And I have in front of me a rather large book titled Customs and Controversies, Intertestamental Jewish Backgrounds of the New Testament. And the author of the book is J. Julius Scott. Dr. J. Julius Scott is professor of biblical and historical studies at Wheaton College Graduate School. And Dr. Scott, it's a pleasure to have you on the program today.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you.
When you look at Customs and Controversies and what took place in the intertestamental period, your purpose in writing that book is not simply to give to us a Jewish background history, is it?
No, it's not. It is to try to set the stage for the New Testament so that the New Testament reader can look at the history, the culture, the aspirations, the issues of that world, see how the New Testament writers deal with it, and then take that as a springboard to come back to our world and to apply those same principles as we seek to live the Christian life today.
When you think about the historical grammatical approach to the New Testament, it is important, is it not, in biblical interpretation to understand something of the historical context in which the material is being written?
That is absolutely the situation, and that is the major reason that I wrote the book.
Now, when you look at the history of Judaism, would you divide the history of Judaism into various periods? And if so, how would you mark those periods?
There are, of course, many small periods that we could mention, but there are three major ones. The period that we call the period of classical Hebrew history, which is essentially the Old Testament. It ends in 586 to 87 BC, when the Babylonian general Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem, the temple, and carried the intelligentsia of the Hebrew people to Babylon as captives. The return, which is also a part of the Old Testament, is also the beginning of the second period of history. And it runs until AD 70, when the Roman general Titus again destroyed Jerusalem and its temple. Following that is what we know today, the Judaism that we know today, basically various divisions and applications of rabbinic Judaism, the religion of the rabbis. The period in between the two destructions of Jerusalem is the one that we're talking about. You have referred to it as have I in the title of the book, Intertestamental Judaism. There are many other names for it. Our Jewish friends prefer to call it Second Temple or Second Commonwealth Judaism. It's all referring to the same period.
All right, now when you talk about that period ending in 586 with Nebuchadnezzar and the destruction of Solomon's temple, how significant was it, the rebuilding of the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah? I guess there were people who did remember Solomon's temple because their captivity lasted about 70 years, who wept when they saw Ezra's temple. Was that a significant event, the rebuilding of that temple, or did that really pale by comparison with Herod's temple?
The temple was smaller, and as you have mentioned, the book of Ezra and also Haggai note the fact that to many people the second temple was less glorious. Herod's temple is a little difficult to describe.
Did you say glorious or gloryless?
The temple of Nehemiah and Ezra-Nehemiah had less glory than the period of the Temple of Solomon.
Now, when you talk about that, the temple of the Bible declares and speaks about when Solomon's temple was built and was dedicated, how the Shekinah glory came down and even seeped out of the Holy of Holies into the holy place. I mean, the way they define that presence of God in the temple, that was really not known in Ezra's temple or even in Herod's temple, for that matter.
It's very interesting that you should bring that up. I've just completed reading a book that makes a great deal of that point, and says that therefore to many Jews, the exile has never been completed because the Shekinah glory has not returned, and that in some forms of modern Judaism, especially Orthodox Judaism, there is still the looking for the coming of the return of the presence of God.
And so, but as Christians we say, and we beheld his glory, the glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth.
Exactly. When Jesus visited the temple, the glory returned.
Yeah. That is fascinating. You know, exactly. I'm sure you do remember, when did the glory depart from the temple? What was the event there? Do you recall?
I don't believe there is a specific point in the New Testament.
Or in the Old Testament?
In the Old Testament, when it says the glory departed, it is perhaps significant by implication that the temple built in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and also Herod's temple, did not have the Ark of the Covenant, which of course was the symbolic presence of God with his people. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant, no one knows. There are many legends as far as Judaism is concerned, and I guess Indiana Jones had his own.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. I mean, we all know it's in a box somewhere in that big room. I mean, it's Indiana Jones found it, but anyway, obviously.
It is significant that the Ark of the Covenant was not there, and therefore that which symbolized the presence of God was not in the temple.
And so the
Intertestamental period.
The Holy of Holies was empty.
The Holy of Holies was empty. In 63 to 64 BC, when the Roman general Pompey conquered Jerusalem and wanted to enter the Holy of Holies, the priest objected, basically said, "You will enter over our dead bodies," and he said that can be arranged, and there was a slaughter among the priests. He entered the Holy of Holies. There'd been many rumors in the Gentile world what was in there, and he walked out amazed that there was absolutely nothing there.
That's fascinating. Now, when we go into that period of time, that period of history between the Testaments, if we could just kind of review it, after Nebuchadnezzar, you had the Persians, and then you had the return. And about when does Malachi end, and when the Old Testament ends, what is happening?
The Jewish historian Josephus, who is roughly a contemporary of the Apostle Paul, says that the Old Testament was completed by the end of the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes Longomanos, which is about 424 BC. The Persians are in control. The Hebrew state is a small part of a larger province on the western end of the Great Persian Empire. The province was called the province beyond the river. The Hebrews had been allowed to reestablish their own government, their own religion, though they were still subject to the Persians. And both the ends of the book of Nehemiah and the book of Malachi suggest that they had become very bored, become very careless in their observance of religious things. Here they were, just more or less a backwater They had expected the Messiah to return, to come. They had expected great things, and now it was just a very small, overlooked group of people.
All right, we're talking with Dr. J. Julius Scott, Professor of Biblical and Historical Studies at Wheaton College Graduate School, author of the book Customs and Controversies, the Intertestamental Jewish Backgrounds of the New Testament. And as we go along in this, if you do have any questions or comments, we'd certainly love to hear from you. 725-1913. That's 725-1913, or toll free 1-800-730-2727. In your book, you state that the most significant event in intertestamental Judaism has to be the Hellenistic influence, or Alexander the Great.
Yes.
Because when we read the book of Acts, when we go into the book of Acts, for example, immediately now we're confronted with Hellenistic Jews and with Hebraic Jews.
That's correct, in Acts chapter 6, verse 1.
Yeah. Now, tell us.
Also, when we go into the New Testament, we are confronted with a piece of literature that was written in Greek rather than Hebrew.
Which is a switch, isn't it?
Very, very drastic switch.
Now, tell us a little bit about what, we only got a minute before we go to break, so you might start now, and then we'll have to continue it. A little bit about Alexander the Great, what kind of person he was, and his influence, especially upon the Bible.
Alexander the Great was a very young man. He died at 33. He was not a pure Greek. He was a Macedonian, which is today northern Greece. His father, Philip the Great, had conquered all of Greece and started an empire. Alexander himself brought his father's holdings together and then began to march into the ancient world, primarily at first to protect the Jewish colonies along the western coast of what is now Turkey, but he knew he was going to have to contend with Darius, the great Persian king.
All right, we got to stop there. We'll take a break for 1 minute. We'll get back and deal with who was Alexander the Great and what was his influence. Stay with us. Welcome back to Issues Etc. Our guest is Dr. J. Julius Scott, Professor of Biblical and Historical Studies at Wheaton College Graduate School. He authored the book Customs and Controversies, Intertestamental Jewish Backgrounds of the New Testament. Again, as we go along in our program, 725-1913. That's 725-1913, or 1-800-730-2727. 1-800-730-2727. If you have any questions or comments for Dr. Scott regarding the book, Customs and Controversies, the Intertestamental Period, love to hear from you. All right, so Alexander knew that he would have to confront the Persians, and he marched into the lands of the antiquities, and what happened?
Well, he first of all defeated Darius at the Battle of Issus, and then he began to move southward along the eastern seaboard, a rather long siege of Tyre. Then he moved into the land of Israel. Now, exactly what happened there is a matter of controversy. There is one account that says the Jewish high priest met him and said that he had been predicted by the prophet Daniel, and they heralded him as the next great leader, and he accepted their praise and more or less left the Hebrews undisturbed, went down, defeated Greece, came back, and then began to move to the east and got all the way to Punjab in India. The other part of the question, though, is more important. What was his influence? Alexander was perhaps the first conqueror of world history who was interested not only in lands and economic gains, but also in ideological conquest. He carried with him, with his army, city planners, artists, authors, teachers, philosophers, including his own teacher, Aristotle, and many others, because he wanted to implant Greek Greek culture wherever he went. For the Hebrews, this would have been a massive change from basically a rural to an urban culture, as well as many, many other things.
In other words, it would be similar that if, for example, when we went into battle in our armies, that we would have with us our educators, our doctors of philosophy, our historians who would talk about the great American history, probably would bring along some basketball players and baseball players and some of our artists and musicians, and try to bring some rock and roll performers and try to implant our culture into that land.
Exactly.
That's fascinating when you think about it. They were a part of the army.
They were
a part
of the whole entourage of the army.
How big, any suggestion as to how large that whole entourage was?
I'm sure there are statistics, but I don't have them at my fingertips.
All right, so now, how did any of the culture that you say he left Israel and left them alone, but did any of the culture remain?
Let me answer that in a couple of different ways. First of all, what Alexander succeeded in spreading was not the pure Greek culture of Homer and Plato and Socrates. His culture came up against the cultures of other lands, the Persians, the Egyptians, etc., etc. And as it did, the Greek culture was modified. The Greek language was modified, so that what Alexander did not succeed in spreading pure classical Greek culture, but forming a culture that was an amalgamation of those other cultures that it met, and had great significance. Now, I said that the Hebrews were left undisturbed. That is much oversimplified. The land of Israel is divided into a number of different geographical areas, although it is a very small area. The area along the Mediterranean coast had felt Greek culture well before Alexander. But when we say they were left undisturbed, I'm speaking primarily of the more protected areas up in the high hills around Jerusalem. Following the death of Alexander, the land of Israel became the point of a tug of war between two empires established by his generals, both of whom wanted domination over the land of Israel. It first went to the control of the Ptolemaic Empire in the south, Egypt, and the Ptolemaic Empire was strongly Hellenistic, and there was much influence in various parts of the land of Israel from the Hellenism coming up from the south. There is extant a correspondence of a man by the name of Zeno who traveled into Israel during that period, and he shows that Hellenism has had an influence in a lot of the areas, especially away from the central part of the country. About the year 200, the northern kingdom of the Seleucids, or we could call them the Syrians, defeated the Ptolemies and took over the land of Israel. Within a relatively few years, there came a man, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was determined to force Greek culture, including Greek religion, upon the Jews. And this, of course, changed things radically.
And now this is that abomination of desolation that Daniel allegedly referred to, or some people see it, that this guy Antiochus Epiphanes, what did he do? Sacrificed a pig on the altar in Israel. And what are the traditions about this guy? I mean, this guy was a real brute according to Jewish tradition.
Well, first of all, the word Epiphanes is, of course, the word from which we get the word epiphany, which means an appearance of God. He modestly thought himself to be God. The abomination of desolation probably is a prediction or a statement of, I believe, prediction, of the statue of Zeus, which many believe looked very much like Antiochus himself, that was placed in the temple. He sacrificed to Zeus. He even sacrificed a pig on the golden altar in Jerusalem. He forbade circumcision of Jewish boys. He prohibited any kind of continuation of Jewish rites.
Now that, again, led to a group of revolutionaries rising up, did it not?
It did. In Modin, a aged priest by the name of Matthias, when the officers of Antiochus came and said, "You must offer sacrifice to the pagan gods," the aged priest was there. Finally, one Jew made such a sacrifice. The officer said to Matthias, "You must be next." So he stepped forward and he killed the renegade Jew and the officer and said, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law follow me." And he and his 5 sons retreated into the wilderness of Judea to the east of Jerusalem and began probably what was one of the first guerrilla warfares of ancient history.
Now that is recorded, is it not, in those 2 books of the Maccabees? Is that right?
It is recorded both in the 2 books of the Maccabees and also in the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus.
It's interesting. Have you ever seen some of those writings, folks, like the apocryphal books? The 1st and 2nd Maccabees deals with that very, very interesting history of Judas Maccabeus and his brothers and so forth. All right, we got to take a break for 1 minute, and then our phone number is 725-1913. That's 725-1913 or 1-800-730-2727. If you have any questions or comments, would certainly love to hear from you. We'll be coming back in just a few minutes. Now, we're at the point of the Maccabean revolt, and of course, we'll talk about that. We'll get into that issue. And then to take it from there, and we got the Romans yet ahead, and then culminate our whole discussion here, if we could, at the birth of our Lord Jesus and Judaism during that period. So it's kind of fascinating when you read that. It is fascinating reading the New Testament in the light of the intertestamental history. All right, so we'll be coming back with Dr. J. Julius Scott in just a few minutes. You stay with us. We'll also go to the phones when we get back, so stay with us. To Issues, Etc. Don Matzat here. My guest is Dr. J. Julius Scott, Professor of Biblical and Historical Studies at Wheaton College Graduate School, author of the great book, Customs and Controversies, a book that I guess Johnny Carson would have to say everything you ever wanted to know about the intertestamental period, and it is a rather thorough study of everything that was taking place there and how it impacted what we see in the New Testament, okay? If you have any questions or comments, 725-1913 or 1-800-730-2727. Let's go to Juanita, Nebraska, and talk to Jim. Hey, Jim, what's on your mind?
Well, I have a question about the Hellenized Jews that were referred to in Acts. What is a Hellenized Jew?
Dr. Scott, what is a Hellenized Jew?
The result of the coming of Hellenism into the Jewish world created a variety of different reactions. There were some Jews, in fact, a fair number of them, who accepted Hellenism. They wanted to be Greek in every way possible. They spoke Greek. They dressed like Greeks. They went to Greek forms of entertainment. Some even went to took on Greek religion. The Maccabean revolt, of which we were speaking just before the break, resulted that in the rejection of paganism, of Greek religions, by Jews. But there were many Jews who continued to basically live as Greeks, though at the same time they carried on their traditional religious worship along the patterns of the Old Testament.
Would it be similar, let's say, to what was taking place in Iran under the Shah, and then as they returned under the Ayatollah to the Muslim culture? I mean, under the Shah, it was so very much westernized, and then all of a sudden in came the Ayatollah, and now the whole culture has changed, the dress has changed. Would that be similar?
Yeah, there's some similarity there. I have just come back from teaching in another country, but which I do every now and then. Several years ago, I taught in Nigeria, and it was very interesting, the class that I taught, which incidentally was on the same subject that we're talking about here. There were people there who wanted to be traditional Africans. They wore their traditional African robes. They lived as traditional Africans. There were also those who wanted to dress and act as Western as possible. And I had them both in the same classroom.
Did they get along?
Well, yeah, they got along fine.
But it was just a preference.
It was a preference. Now, in the New Testament, our questioner was asking about Hellenistic Judaism. Intertestamental Judaism, and this is one of the major characteristics of it, is that it was very diverse. It was much more interested in right practice rather than in right belief, with exception of the commitment to one God, belief in the covenant that God had made with Israel, and then some form of practice of the law. There were many, many different varieties. The two basic varieties are the varieties of Semitic or Hebraic Judaism and Hellenistic. Hellenistic Judaism preferred to speak Greek. Hebraic Judaism preferred to speak Hebrew or Aramaic. Many different things of that sort. The Hellenistic Jew is one who tried to be a consistent Jew religiously, but yet embrace as much of this New World culture as he possibly could.
Now, when we're talking about the Maccabean revolt, what year are we going into? About about
164 to 63 BC.
All right. Now, that was directly related to Antiochus Epiphanes coming into what year was that when Epiphanes came into the temple?
About 167.
All right. Now, what happened under the Maccabean revolt? And from what I understand, the Jews did gain independence, did they not?
Yes, Mattathias, the old priest, who was probably over 100 years old when he led this revolt, died very soon, and his son, Judas Maccabeus, hence we get the name Maccabean period or Hasmonean period because that was the family name, Hasmon, succeeded in forcing the Seleucids out of the temple. The Hebrews regained control of the temple, and Judas Maccabeus, a priest, rededicated the relighting of the lights of the temple, is celebrated to this day in the Feast of Hanukkah, which our Jewish friends celebrate about the same time we're celebrating Christmas. That resulted in religious independency, but not political independency. The struggle continued. In about 143 BC, a brother of Judas Maccabeus, Simon, succeeded in obtaining political independence as well.
All right, so from 143 BC until when? 63 BC?
63, 64 BC, when the Romans came in.
All right, so now with this political and religious independence, the religion is free to develop again. What were some of the things that took place during the Maccabean or as you'd say, the Hasmonean period, during that period of independence, and we're talking 143 to about 80 years here? What were some of the things that took place?
Well, let me just speak briefly geographically and politically. The land of Israel was expanded to include a fairly large area, almost as large as the empires of David and Solomon. Religiously, there began to develop a great number of different interpretations of how the law should be interpreted. And this begins a number of different groups. They are sometimes called sects, but that kind of has a bad connotation. I prefer to call them denominations, because they're all Jews. They regard themselves as good practicing Jewish people, but they have traditional interpretations of how ceremonies are to be carried out, how certain laws are to be observed, how the scriptures are to be interpreted, and this creates these denominational groups. But yet we must understand that the vast majority were what I would call average Jews, the common people. But you still have this division of Judaism going on.
And so would you mark that by, was it Pharisees and Sadducees at this point, or is that too early?
Probably sometime shortly after Judas Maccabeus. We have references to the Pharisees and Sadducees, but the references are of such a nature that they assume that these two groups have been there all along. But there are other groups as well. Those two are known from the New Testament. The New Testament also mentions the Herodians, the Zealots. Ancient Jewish sources mention a number of others. The best known are the Essenes, who we assume one group of them wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we could go on and on. There were a lot of different sectarian groups, all claiming to be thoroughly Orthodox Jews, divided on the points of how one observes the law or observes other things, divided also on this matter of culture that we've already talked about.
Now, when we leave behind the Old Testament, we don't hear anything about the Samaritans, and all of a sudden we come into the New Testament and we find this Good Samaritan. When did these Samaritans appear on the scene, and how did they arrive?
Well, would like to suggest that we have the beginnings of the Samaritans in the Old Testament. In 2 Kings, I think, 17, we read of the destruction of the northern kingdom, Israel, by the Assyrians in 722 BC.
Right.
And the Assyrians bring in foreigners who intermarry with some of the few native Jews who live there. And also they begin to teach pagan religions. And the result is a mixed breed racially and religiously. When Ezra and Nehemiah returned, some people from that northern area wanted to help rebuild the temple, and the Jewish authorities refused to allow them to do so. Sometime during the intertestamental period, they seem to have built their own temple in what is today near Nablus on Mount Gerizim. And that was destroyed by the fourth of the Maccabean rulers, John Hyrcanus. And that destroying of the temple, the rejection of the Samaritan help, and began long hostilities between the Jews and Samaritans, and wars, and a good deal of bloodshed as well.
Well, how did the Jews then get above the Samaritans into what is called the Galilee? You know, where Jesus, of course, grew up in Galilee, and yet it's this kind of a strange geography, isn't it? You got Judea down here, the temple in Jerusalem, then you got this whole band of Samaritans in the middle, and then you go up to Galilee.
One of the Jewish Maccabean rulers went north and reconquered that land and brought it into the Jewish orbit. The Samaritans were under the Jewish thumb, so to speak, at that particular time. But when the Romans came in, there were a recognition of some of these other groups. There was a third area. You've mentioned Galilee, you've mentioned Judea. That which is referred to in the Bible as the land beyond the river, or Perea, just to the eastern side of the Jordan River. Those three areas, Galilee, Perea, and Judea, were the only lands at the time of the New Testament that were inhabited primarily by Jews. There were other areas, the Samaritans, those who lived in Decapolis, those who were just to the north, the lands of Tyre and Sidon, the area that Jesus went when he was near Caesarea Philippi. All of those were basically Gentile lands and were thoroughly Hellenistic in their culture. And this was a result of the redivision of territories when the Romans came in.
All right, so we got Jewish independence for 80 years. Now we're going to get up to about 63 BC, the destruction of the temple.
No, not the destruction, the takeover.
The takeover of the temple, all right. And we'll bring it up into Herod's time and so forth, and up to the time of Jesus. A fascinating historical review. We'll be coming back in just 1 minute. You have any questions? 725-1913, 1-800-730-2727. Are you learning anything today? I know I am. Stay with us. We'll continue our story. Be right back. And welcome back to Issues, Etc. My guest this first hour, Dr. J. Julius Scott, author of the book Customs and Controversies, Intertestamental Jewish Backgrounds of the New Testament. Again, if you have any questions or comments, 725-1913 or 1-800-730-2727. All right, we're about 63 BC. What's the political situation like?
The controversy between the descendants of the original Maccabean brothers has escalated. Brother is fighting brother. There's a great deal of corruption in the land. The priestly caste is set against the Pharisaic caste or a group of people. Some make an appeal to the Roman general Pompey, who is in the area. Pompey had not come into the area to attack the Jews. He was going down to Egypt to visit his girlfriend, Cleopatra. But like every good Roman general, he had his army with him, so he dropped into Jerusalem and took over by force. And from then on, throughout the New Testament period and well into the so-called Roman period, in fact into the 300s AD, the Romans were in charge.
In 37 BC, we encounter a strange man by the name of Herod the Great. Who was he?
Herod the Great was an Idumean. The Idumeans were non-Jews who had settled in the southern part of the country. One of the Maccabean rulers, John Hyrcanus, moved down, conquered those people, and said, you're either going to become circumcised and become Jewish proselytes, or I will kill you. An amazing conversion rate took place.
I imagine it was effective.
And Herod the Great was the son of one of these Idumeans who was a political functionary par excellence. He was behind the scenes, cooperated with the Romans, and the Romans eventually appointed Herod as king. Now, that does not mean absolute monarch. It means a vassal under the Roman government, but he was Jewish by name.
So Herod was actually, by religion, a circumcised Jew.
He was a circumcised Jew. He practiced the Jewish religion, but he also practiced pagan Hellenistic religions.
All right, now it seems, that the guy, when you look at some of the ruins that are in Israel, I mean, last time we were there, we looked at that road that Herod built, and the guy was an incredible builder, wasn't he?
He was a fantastic builder, and as you have said, the remains of many of his construction projects are evident even today. Even the ruins of the Temple Mount, you can detect certain stones there that have the distinctive Herodian markings on them. He built the whole ancient city of Caesarea, including going out into the water and building a breakwater so there could be a harbor there. He built a tremendous temple to Caesar Augustus in what used to be the old city of Samaria, the Old Testament city of Samaria. and we could go on and on.
All right, so now the building of the temple in Jerusalem under Herod, did he do this independently, or did he consult with the Jews? Hey, guys, you want a new temple? I mean, how did he do this? Did he say, we're giving you a new temple? Was this involved with the religion of the day?
Herod was determined to turn the city of Jerusalem into a Hellenistic city. And the old temple built by those who first returned had fallen into disrepair. But also, during the feast times, there were thousands and thousands of Jews coming to Jerusalem wanting to get near the temple and couldn't get there. Herod used new technology, namely the Roman arch, built an extension to the temple platform well over what is the Kidron Valley. This whole platform is 35 acres in size. You can still walk on it today. He essentially rebuilt the temple, but what he really claimed to be doing was refurbishing that temple that we read about in Ezra and Nehemiah. He enlarged it, he beautified it.
So when we're in Jerusalem today, when you walk on Temple Mount, that big rectangular slab there, that is actually what Herod constructed.
That is the area that Herod built.
All right.
The lower stones in that platform are the ones that Herod put there. Many of them had been torn down and was rebuilt during the 16th century.
Now, of course, when he built the temple, there was, again, no Ark of the Covenant to put in it. You know, there are a lot of people who have the impression the Ark is still somewhere down below under Temple Mount. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, there is a Jewish tradition that the prophet Jeremiah took it and hid it on Mount Sinai, another tradition that it is there. It's interesting to note that in the book of Revelation, there's a reference to the Ark of the Covenant being in heaven.
Yeah.
I don't have any guess as to where it is. The temple, the Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God, and the presence of God was represented when Jesus entered the temple.
So probably they're not going to find this thing.
I don't think so.
Because if in New Testament age, it would kind of be a going backwards, would it not? Since the Ark of the Covenant is represented in the Christ. He is the hilasterion, as they say in Greek, the mercy seat. And so we really, so many Christians are looking for the Ark to be discovered. I wonder if that's almost a backward glance.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be.
All right, now, here, we got to get up to this point. There was a time, I guess in about, could be as late as 8 BC or somewhere in there, when shepherds saw angels and wise men came from the east because a king was born. Now, tell us about Herod's response. Why did Herod respond the way he responded? People, I've heard it said that the guy was a paranoid.
Well, that's the word that I would have used, especially during his latter life. He killed wives, children, friends, as well as enemies. Anybody who could be seen as a threat to his throne was a goner. We do not have any ancient records confirming the slaughter of the babies in Bethlehem, but all of the records that we do have of him, that's exactly the type of thing he would have done.
So when Jesus came unto his own, as the Bible says, and his own received him not, you've got a religion there that has passed through this intertestamental period of time. Basically, what is Jesus confronting? Anything that is authentically Jewish, something that has become highly traditional and politicized? Just what is the Lord Jesus confronting in the Judaism of his day?
Well, Don, I appreciate you asking that question, and I want to answer it in two ways. Number one, by the time Jesus arrived, there are many different groups who are looking for many different kinds of messiahs or revival or restoration movements. Jesus did not fit any of them, though he can be described, various parts of his ministry can be described as the type of thing that somebody might have expected. But he fit nobody's preconceived notions, and therefore we have a coalition of many of the different Jewish groups that came together to have him executed. Secondly, one of the most important parts of the book, in my opinion, is that last section in which we talk about some of Jewish theology. And here are some areas, and I know we're about out of time, where the Dead Sea Scrolls have clarified some things, and we can see now, as a result of the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the materials that we had previously can be read in a different light and help us to understand the type of thing that Jesus and the early Christians were up against. And Jesus was a major threat to established Judaism of that day and to every one of the denominational sectarian groups.
So they weren't really able to categorize him, were they? I've often wondered, they couldn't put him into a file folder.
They couldn't put him into a file folder, and they did not recognize what he was doing. I think primarily many of these groups were looking for the type of thing that had existed during the Maccabean period, namely political independence.
Yeah.
And Jesus, when he entered the temple in Jerusalem, did not attack the Roman garrison on the Antonia fort that was right there on the temple wall,
but rather
he attacked the religious abuses in the temple court.
Dr. J. Julius Scott, it's really been great talking to you today, and I thank you so much sharing your knowledge with us. The name of the book is Customs and Controversies, Intertestamental Jewish Backgrounds of the New Testament. Baker has put it out. I encourage, if you're interested in his history, you got to get yourself a copy of this book and read it through. You'll learn a great deal. Dr. Scott, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Don.
Take care now.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Hey, I learned a lot there. That was, the perspective on that, to understand the kind of world Jesus came into and why people dealt with him as they did. All right, we'll be coming back. We're going to be talking about Mormon missionaries during the second hour with Janice Hutchinson. Please stay with us. I'll be back in a few minutes.
Join author and pastor Don Matzat Monday through Friday on Issues, Etc. Issues, Etc. is a listener-supported program. Your financial support is critical for our ministry to continue. For a cassette copy of today's program, call 1-800-844-0524. That's 1-800-844-0524. Opinions expressed are not necessarily in agreement with those of this station or the Jubilee Network. Our address is Post Office Box 9360, St. Louis, Missouri, 63117.